I hear quite often of people being worried or scared to start fermenting food, or just not knowing where to start. So in this video, I'm going to show you what, in my opinion, is the easiest ferment to do, and just also what happens to be one of my favorite ferments to make. I'm going to be making sauerkraut with only a few ingredients, and sauerkraut can really be as simple as just cabbage and salt, but it's also a great ferment to experiment with adding other seasonings or vegetables to add more flavor. And for those watching who make their own sauerkraut already, leave a comment below with your favorite sauerkraut seasoning because I'm genuinely curious to try some of them. The first and most obvious thing we're going to need is cabbage. Personally, I like the taste of red cabbage sauerkraut and I think it looks really good too, but regular white cabbage is the most common for making sauerkraut. Wash your cabbage if you need to. I wash mine, then I pat it dry, but I also like to peel the outer layer of leaves and discard those. I like to cut it in half and then use a knife to cut it as thin as possible. I used to do this with a mandolin, but mandolins kind of scare me and I don't want to cut the tips of my fingers off, so I usually opt for the manual cutting method, which actually works better and faster for me. I work my way through the cabbage and I change the angles when I get near the thick base stem thingy. I really try to get as close to the base as possible to get most out of my cabbage. One tool that will make your life easier in this situation is bench scraper, which for the longest time I didn't have, but when I finally got one, oh boy did it change my life. It makes it so much easier to scoop stuff up and to scrape your workbench, I guess. Okay, so after working through the entire cabbage, this is how thin I was able to get my slices, which for me is perfect as I like a little thickness since it adds crunch. I'll dump all my cabbage into a bowl and then weigh that. You want to keep note of this because we need to do some simple math in a minute. I actually forgot to zero out my scale at this point before adding my cabbage, but that's why a few months ago I made it a point to weigh all of my mixing bowls and note their weight, so now I just need to subtract the weight of the bowl from the overall weight. Anyways, so here's why we need to weigh our cabbage. The type of fermentation we're doing is called lactofermentation, and the tanginess of sauerkraut comes from the production of lactic acid by bacteria called lactobacillus. By adding salt, we can keep other types of bacteria from growing, and instead, salt-tolerant lactobacillus bacteria will feed on the sugars in the cabbage to produce lactic acid. Someone can fact check me in the comments if I missed anything out there. But basically, all you need to know is that we have to add 2% of the total weight of the cabbage in salt. And I try to avoid using volumetric measurements for this since different size salt crystals can drastically affect the amount of salt you're adding. I'll be honest, I don't really remember how much cabbage I had here, but let's just say for example if you had 1 kilogram of cabbage or 1000 grams of cabbage, 2% of 1000 is 20. So we're going to add 20 grams of salt. And the salt you add has to be non-iodized salt, otherwise fermentation won't work. I use natural sea salt, but kosher salt also works great. Okay, so to swing back to the recipe, I've added 2% of the weight of my cabbage in salt, and now I'm going to incorporate everything together with my hands. If you're using red cabbage, you might want to wear food-safe gloves and an apron because this red juice just gets everywhere. At this point, I'll add my extra seasoning, which for this batch will be a few fresh garlic cloves, crushed and roughly chopped up, and then about a teaspoon or 2 of coriander seeds. I always add garlic to my sauerkraut, but the coriander seeds will be something new for me, so it'll be interesting to see how this turns out. I'll throw all those in and then give it another toss in my hands, and the goal is to really massage all the salt into the cabbage to draw out some of the liquid. But don't throw away the liquid, just let it collect in the bottom of the bowl. At this point, I'll actually leave this in the bowl for an hour or two to let the salt keep working and draw out the liquid. Every so often, whenever I'm in the kitchen, I'll give it another toss and squeeze and then leave it again. Eventually, when I'm happy with how soft and bendy all the cabbage has become, I'll transfer it to a clean glass or ceramic jar. You can use food grade plastic too, which shouldn't be much of a problem because this is a relatively short ferment, and let's be honest, once this is done fermenting, it's gone within a few days because of how addictive it is. I'm going to use a glass jar here, and I'll transfer everything over, including all the liquid that came out of the cabbage, and then using a rolling pin or a muddler, I'll give everything a nice little push down. The goal here is to try push the cabbage down until it's covered by its own juice. And just as an extra precaution, I'll also use some plastic wrap, pushing it down onto the surface to cover it and minimize exposure to air. I'll also throw some glass fermentation weights on it too, but you can also use a plastic bag of dried beans, which I've done in the past too. Close that up and then leave it somewhere out of direct sunlight at room temperature for a few days. I also threw an airlock onto mine just so I can keep track of the fermentation, but if you're using a jar with a screw top, another thing I like to do is lay a kitchen towel over the top of the lid, then lightly screw the lid back on, which should create a seal that will allow the excess gas to escape. So fast forward about 3 days later and I've noticed a drop in activity in the airlock, so I'm going to check how this tastes. And so far it's starting to taste good. And I think this is ready to go into the fridge where it'll keep fermenting but at a much slower rate because of the cold temperatures. Now you could start eating this now, which I had to stop myself from doing, but another few days in the fridge should just make this much tastier. And when it's ready, literally eat it with anything. I personally like to enjoy it over some avocado feta toast to add a little tang, but this is also great in grilled cheese or just as a side with any meat or heavy meals. Thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed this and you want to see more, make sure you hit the like button to let me know. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to see more fermentation, short videos, and maybe some travel videos in the future. Bye!